Some people spend their whole lives learning how to break the law without getting caught. The smart ones? They never kick open a door while the state attorney general is sitting on the other side of it. The first thing I heard was the sound of tires grinding over wet gravel outside my lake cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Rain hammered the tin roof hard enough to rattle the old rafters above my head, and the smell of soaked cedar drifted through the room every time the wind pushed against the loose window frame near the fireplace. I glanced toward the lake through the dark glass. Headlights were cutting through the rain in long white streaks across the dock. 3 vehicles. HOA security. Right on schedule. Across from me, Howard Bennett calmly set his coffee mug down on the scarred oak table my father built back in 1989. No panique. No surprise. Just that quiet kind of patience powerful men carry when they already know how the story ends. The yellow light above us hummed softly while rainwater dripped from my jacket onto the old pine floorboards. Outside, another car door slammed. Then another. The sound echoed across Blackwater Lake like shotgun thunder rolling through fog. "That your HOA, President?" Howard asked without even looking up from the folder in front of him. Thick folder. Red tabs. Property deeds. Banking records. Internal emails. Enough paper to bury half the county if the investigation ever went public. I gave a slow nod. Cynthia Voss. Howard almost smiled at the name. The woman who thinks she owns the shoreline. I leaned back in my chair and listened to boots crunching through puddles outside the cabin. Cynthia always traveled like she was arriving at a campaign rally. Security guards, flashlights, expensive perfume lingering 10 seconds after she walked through a room. The whole neighborhood knew the routine. Willow Ridge HOA existed for one reason. Cynthia wanted to turn Blackwater Lake into a private luxury retreat for wealthy investors from Chicago and Dallas. Problem was, my cabin sat right in the middle of the shoreline she needed for her expansion deal. My family had owned this property for 43 years, long before the gated community, long before the golf carts and security cameras and fake smiles at HOA meetings. Back when Blackwater Lake was just fishing docks, campfires, and old aluminum boats tied to wooden posts. My father taught me how to repair dock pilings 20 feet from where Cynthia's security SUVs were now idling in the rain. I could still remember the smell of lake mud on his boots and the rough scrape of rope against my palms the first time he showed me how to secure a fishing boat before a storm. Cynthia hated all of it. Said my cabin looked outdated. Said my dock reduced surrounding property values. Said my old fishing boat ruined the premium visual branding of the community. 6 months ago, she tried fining me over the color of my porch light. 2 weeks later, she tried blocking road access to my dock. Last month, she sent contractors to accidentally dump gravel across my boat ramp. Every move carefully hidden behind HOA paperwork and legal language. But people like Cynthia always make one mistake eventually. They get greedy. Howard slowly opened the folder in front of him while thunder rolled low over the lake outside. "You were right about the shell companies," he said quietly. 3 land transfers tied directly to HOA reserve accounts. I stared at the paperwork spread across the table. Fake landscaping invoices. Fraudulent shoreline repair contracts. Quiet payoffs routed through development firms connected to Cynthia's attorney, Travis Keene. Millions of dollars moving through Blackwater Lake, while homeowners argued about mailbox paint colors and lawn violations. The entire HOA operation was rotten beneath the surface. And tonight, they were finally stupid enough to expose themselves. A flashlight beam suddenly sliced across the cabin windows. Then another. The smell of wet asphalt and gasoline drifted in through the cracks around the front door. One of the security guards shouted something outside, his voice muffled beneath the rain. Howard calmly closed the folder. "You expecting this to escalate?" I looked toward the door just as heavy footsteps climbed onto the front porch. The old wood creaked beneath the weight. Slow, angry, impatient. Then came Cynthia's voice sharp enough to cut through the storm itself. "Mason Grady, open this door right now." I could practically picture her standing there in one of those expensive white raincoats she liked wearing around the lake like she was running for governor instead of terrorizing homeowners over landscaping rules. I stayed seated. The fireplace cracked softly beside me while rainwater hissed down the chimney outside. Cynthia pounded the door again. Harder this time. You are currently violating emergency HOA enforcement regulations. Howard adjusted his tie and finally looked up at me. Calm as ever. Well, he said quietly, this should save us the trouble of scheduling interviews tomorrow morning. Then the deadbolt shook violently under another hit from outside, and the entire cabin fell silent except for the sound of rain hammering the lake. The strange thing about Blackwater Lake is how quiet it gets right before a storm fully breaks loose. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet, the kind that makes every dock row creak louder and every screen door sound like a warning. I bought that cabin 12 years ago after my divorce finalized and my construction business nearly collapsed during the housing crash. Back then, the place looked like it was one hard winter away from sliding straight into the lake. Rotten support beams, broken windows, half the dock underwater. Most people saw junk. I saw the same thing my father used to see in old marinas and damaged fishing boats. Good bones. The cabin sat on 2 acres of shoreline at the northern edge of Blackwater Lake, where the pine trees grew thick enough to block the noise from the newer subdivisions farther south. Every board in that place carried history. My father spent 3 summers rebuilding the dock with me before cancer took him in 2014. I can still remember the smell of sawdust mixed with lake water while he sat on an upside-down bucket teaching me how to straighten warped cedar planks with steam and clamps instead of replacing them. Anybody can buy something new, he used to say while wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his work shirt. Takes patience to restore something worth keeping. Cynthia Voss hated that cabin from the second she became HOA president 4 years ago. She wanted clean lines, modern stone houses, expensive glass railings overlooking the lake. Everything polished enough to photograph for real estate brochures. My place stood out like a scar in the middle of her perfect little resort fantasy. She once told me during an HOA meeting that my dock looked like a scene from a documentary about economic decline. I just smiled and kept drinking my coffee while her supporters laughed around the clubhouse table. What Cynthia never understood was that people around Blackwater Lake trusted me long before they ever trusted her. I repaired storm-damaged docks after spring floods. I helped elderly neighbors reinforce seawalls before winter freezes. I spent weekends pulling stranded fishing boats out of mud after engine failures. Meanwhile, Cynthia drove around the neighborhood in a pearl white Range Rover handing out violation notices over mailbox paint and trash bin placement. The smell of money followed her everywhere. Expensive perfume, leather interiors, fresh landscaping crews trimming lawns every Friday morning like clockwork. But beneath all that polished lakefront luxury, something ugly had been growing for years. Property owners disappearing. Cabins bought under pressure. Families suddenly selling shoreline lots below market value after mysterious code violations appeared. One old fisherman named Earl Benson lost his boathouse after the HOA claimed it violated new shoreline regulations. 3 months later, Cynthia's development partners bought his land through a shell company registered 2 counties away. That was the moment I started paying attention. And once I started looking closely at Willow Ridge HOA, I realized the lake was not being managed. It was being harvested. The war between me and Cynthia Voss did not explode overnight. People like her do not start with bulldozers and lawyers. They start small, quiet, petty. They test how much pressure you can take before you finally break. First came the violation letters taped to my front door every Monday morning. Improper docklighting. Anoseriais de exterior paintahin. Unsafe. Shoreline aesthetics. I still remember standing barefoot on my porch one cold October morning, holding 3 separate citations while fog rolled across the lake behind me, and the smell of wet leaves drifted through the pine trees. The fine started at $200, then $500, then $1,000. Every month, the numbers climbed higher. Cynthia weaponized paperwork the same way some people use hammers. Loud enough to intimidate. Constant enough to wear you down. Then came the security patrols. Black SUVs crawling slowly past my cabin at night, with headlights sweeping across my windows like prison spotlights. One evening I stepped outside carrying a toolbox and found two HOA guards photographing my dock from the shoreline. The younger one could not have been older than 23. Nervous eyes. Cheap rain jacket. He kept avoiding eye contact, while Cynthia stood behind him holding a clipboard against her chest like some suburban field commander inspecting enemy territory. Routine compliance review, she said with that polished smile she used whenever she was about to ruin somebody's week. Her voice always sounded rehearsed. Smooth. Artificial. Like she practiced conversations in front of a mirror before HOA meetings. The wind off the lake carried the sharp smell of gasoline from their idling SUVs while rain tapped softly against the hood of my truck parked beside the cabin. I asked what exactly they were reviewing. Cynthia pointed toward my fishing boat tied at the dock. Residents have expressed concerns about visual deterioration affecting shoreline value. I almost laughed right there. That old aluminum fishing boat belonged to my father. Same boat he used to teach me how to cast for bass before sunrise every summer. Same faded blue paint. Same patched seat cushions. Same cracked steering wheel wrapped in electrical tape 20 years ago. To Cynthia, it was an eyesore. To me, it was family history floating on water. A week later, someone cut power to my dock lights. 3 days after that, my access gate mysteriously jammed shut during a thunderstorm while I was hauling lumber supplies back from town. I spent 2 hours standing in freezing rain with a flashlight and socket wrench trying to get the chain mechanism loose while lightning flashed over Blackwater Lake. Next morning, Cynthia emailed the entire neighborhood claiming my unstable property conditions created potential liability risks for nearby homeowners. She wanted people afraid of me. That was her strategy. Isolation first. Pressure second. Forced sale third. But the thing about growing up around construction crews and fishermen is you learn how to recognize patterns fast. And once I started tracing the timing of Cynthia's violations against shoreline purchases happening around the lake, I realized she was not protecting property values at all. She was clearing obstacles. The deeper I dug into Willow Ridge HOA, the stranger everything started smelling. Not literally at first. Financial corruption has its own scent once you have been around enough contractors and backroom deals. Stale coffee inside county offices. Cheap printer ink on rushed paperwork. Cologne covering nervous sweat during public hearings. I started noticing all of it. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I drove 30 miles into Brookhaven County to pull public shoreline records from the clerk's office. The courthouse looked exactly how county buildings always look in small lake towns. Faded brick walls, flickering fluorescent lights, carpet that smelled like wet cardboard and old cigarettes, no matter how many times they cleaned it. The clerk behind the records counter recognized my name immediately. That told me more than she realized. "You are the cabin owner up on Blackwater North Shore, right?" she asked while adjusting her glasses. "The one having problems with the HOA." Problems. Funny word for what Cynthia was doing. I nodded and spent 4 straight hours combing through property transfers, zoning adjustments, shoreline permits, and environmental waivers tied to Willow Ridge development projects. The pattern started appearing fast. Every homeowner pressure by Cynthia eventually sold to one of 3 limited liability companies registered through the same downtown law office. Same mailing address. Same signatures hidden behind different corporate names. And every purchase happened below market value, sometimes way below. Earl Benson lost 8 acres of lakefront property for less than half its appraisal value after receiving 27 separate HOA violations in under 6 months. Another widow named Janice Holloway sold her cabin after Cynthia's board suddenly declared her retaining wall a shoreline erosion hazard. 2 months later, the exact same wall passed inspection under the new ownership. My stomach tightened harder with every document I copied. The sound of the old courthouse printer clicking out page after page felt louder than church bells in that silent records room. By sunset, I had enough paperwork stuffed inside my truck to fill a banker's box. But the real discovery came from something almost nobody notices in county filings. Permit timestamps. Cynthia's development partners were receiving environmental approvals before official submissions were even recorded. That should have been impossible, unless somebody inside the county zoning office was moving paperwork quietly behind closed doors. I remember sitting inside my truck afterward with rain sliding down the windshield while the heater blew warm air, smelling faintly of motor oil and damp denim. Blackwater Lake suddenly made a lot more sense. This was never about community standards. It was a land acquisition machine disguised as an HOA. And Cynthia Voss was running point. The next week, things escalated fast. I came home from picking up dock supplies in town and found bright orange notices stapled across my front gate. Emergency shoreline compliance hearing. Immediate attendance required. Failure to appear may result in accelerated property action. The language sounded less like a neighborhood association and more like a debt collector threatening foreclosure. That night, I attended the meeting anyway. Biggest mistake Cynthia ever made. The Willow Ridge clubhouse smelled like expensive candles and fresh hardwood polish. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake while board members sat behind a long stone table pretending they governed a small country instead of a subdivision. Cynthia stood at the center in a cream-colored blazer with a silver lakefront development map, glowing behind her on a projector screen. Every inch of her looked polished enough for television. She started listing violations against my property one by one while homeowners watched in silence. Dock instability, visual deterioration, environmental noncompliance. She made my family cabin sound like an abandoned industrial site poisoning the lake. Then she paused and smiled at the crowd. Mr. Grady has repeatedly resisted reasonable modernization efforts designed to improve community value. Modernization efforts. That was her phrase for driving people out of homes they could no longer afford to defend. I looked around the room and noticed something strange. Nobody would meet my eyes. Not the retirees. Not the younger couples. Not even the fishermen who used to drink coffee with me at the marina before sunrise. Fear changes communities slowly, like water erosion, one quiet crack at a time until the entire shoreline starts collapsing underneath you. Then Cynthia made the mistake that changed everything. She clicked the projector remote and displayed a proposed shoreline redevelopment map. My cabin was gone from it. The room went dead quiet the second my cabin disappeared from Cynthia's redevelopment map. I could hear the low hum of the projector fan and the faint clink of ice against somebody's bourbon glass near the back wall. That was it. No pretending anymore. No fake concern about shoreline aesthetics or dock safety. Cynthia had finally shown everyone what this had always been about. My land, my cabin, my section of the lake. She stood beside the glowing map with one hand resting lightly against the conference table like she was unveiling plans for a luxury resort on television. The North Shore Revitalization Initiative will create substantial long-term value for Willow Ridge homeowners, she said smoothly. Revitalization, another polished word for erasing people. I stared at the screen while rain rolled down the clubhouse windows behind her in crooked silver lines. My dock was gone. My pine trees were gone. In their place sat a sleek marina expansion with private slips, fire pit lounges, and something labeled executive shoreline villas. The worst part was seeing my father's property reduced to a rectangle on a sales presentation. 43 years of family history erased by one projector click. Cynthia noticed me staring and smiled slowly. That same cold smile she always used right before tightening the screws on somebody. Of course, she added, certain residents may qualify for voluntary acquisition incentives before formal proceedings become necessary. There it was. The threat hidden neatly inside corporate language. Sell quietly now or get crushed publicly later. The smell of expensive coffee and lemon furniture polish suddenly made me nauseous. I looked around the room again and finally understood why nobody spoke against her anymore. Cynthia had turned fear into neighborhood policy. Homeowners sat frozen in padded leather chairs pretending not to notice what she was doing because they were terrified their property would be next. Then a voice near the back finally spoke up. What formal proceedings? An older man named Walter Pierce stood slowly from his seat near the fireplace. retired electrician, Vietnam veteran, lived on the lake longer than almost anybody left in Willow Ridge. Cynthia's smile tightened for half a second before snapping right back into place. Potential state shoreline intervention, she replied calmly. Environmental Redevelopment Authority. That caught my attention immediately because I knew enough county law to recognize the problem. No state authority had jurisdiction over private shoreline acquisition inside Blackwater Lake without environmental cause. Cynthia was bluffing. Worse than that, she was using legal terminology to scare homeowners into compliance. Walter noticed it too. I watched his jaw tighten beneath the yellow chandelier light overhead. Funny, he muttered. I worked county utilities 28 years and never heard of Environmental Redevelopment Authority taking lake cabins from taxpayers. A few nervous laughs escaped around the room before dying almost instantly. Cynthia's eyes hardened. Perhaps regulations have evolved since your retirement, Walter. There was venom under the sweetness now, sharp enough to cut through the room. I should have stayed quiet. Probably would have made my life easier. But seeing my family property erased from that map flipped something inside me. I stood slowly from my chair and walked toward the projector screen. The hardwood floor creaked beneath my boots while 30 people watched in complete silence. Interesting timing, I said, because every property targeted for this redevelopment plan seems to end up purchased by shell companies tied to Travis Keen's law office. Cynthia froze, barely noticeable, but I caught it. So did Walter. Across the table, Travis Keen immediately adjusted his tie and leaned forward with the nervous expression of a man suddenly wishing he had left the meeting early. The room temperature felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Rain hammered harder against the windows while the lake outside disappeared into blackness beyond the glass. Cynthia recovered fast. She always did. That accusation is completely inappropriate, she snapped. Then maybe you should explain why elderly homeowners are receiving compliance violations weeks before forced sales happen, I replied calmly. Or why shoreline permits are getting approved before applications are officially filed. A woman near the side wall lowered her wine glass slowly. Another homeowner looked down at the floor. Tiny reactions, tiny cracks, but cracks all the same. Cynthia stepped toward me with her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. You are dangerously close to legal defamation, Mr. Grady. Her perfume hit me before the words fully landed. Expensive, floral, artificial enough to burn the back of your throat. I just smiled. Good thing I brought copies. Then I reached into my jacket and placed a stack of county records directly onto the conference table. The second those county records hit the conference table, the entire clubhouse shifted. You could feel it. Tiny sounds suddenly became louder. The crackling fireplace near the back wall. Ice settling inside whiskey glasses. Rain ticking against the giant lakefront windows like fingers drumming on glass. Fear has a sound when it enters a room. Soft, nervous. Breathing changes first. Then eye contact disappears. Cynthia looked down at the paperwork for exactly 2 seconds before sliding the stack aside like it offended her personally. But Travis Keen reacted differently. His face lost color so fast it looked like somebody dimmed the lights around him. That told me everything I needed to know. I kept my voice calm. Page 7 shows shoreline transfers tied to Holloway Property Holdings. Same mailing address as your downtown office, Travis. Nobody spoke. Page 12 shows environmental permits approved 48 hours before filing. Still silence. I could hear the low hum of the projector behind me warming the back of my neck. Then Walter Pierce slowly stood from his chair again and picked up one of the documents with rough electrician hands stained from decades of honest work. Jesus Christ, he muttered under his breath while adjusting his glasses. These dates are real. Cynthia immediately snapped into damage control mode. This meeting is adjourned, she announced sharply. Any unauthorized distribution of internal redevelopment materials will result in legal consequences. But the room was already slipping away from her. Homeowners started whispering to each other. Quiet first, then louder. Nervous questions bouncing between tables while people flipped through copies of the records I had brought. One younger couple near the back stared at a permit approval date and exchanged the kind of look married people share when they suddenly realize they have been lied to for years. Cynthia's polished image cracked for the first time that night. Barely, but enough. Her jaw tightened hard beneath the chandelier light while she turned toward me with eyes colder than the lake in January. "You think you're very clever, Mason." Her voice dropped low enough that only nearby tables could hear it. "You have absolutely no idea who you are interfering with." Funny thing about threats, they only work when the other person still fears you. By then, I did not, because I had already seen too much. 3 days later, somebody broke into my dock storage shed. Nothing stolen. That was the creepy part. Tools untouched. Fuel cans untouched. Instead, every cabinet door stood open. Every file drawer pulled out. Whoever entered wanted me to know they had searched the place. I stood there at sunrise, staring at muddy boot prints drying across the wooden floor, while cold lake wind rolled through the open shed doors, carrying the sharp smell of algae and gasoline. My stomach tightened immediately. Cynthia had stopped pretending. That same afternoon, I received a certified letter from Travis Keene's office demanding immediate cooperation with pending shoreline redevelopment mediation. The letter offered to purchase my property for nearly 30% below appraisal value. Attached to it was a warning about escalating environmental enforcement action if I refused. There was again pressure, fear, isolation. Same pattern every time. But this time they had made a mistake, because somebody else had started noticing the same pattern too. His name was Howard Bennett. The first call came late on a Thursday night while I was replacing dock boards under a portable floodlight. The lake was black as motor oil beyond the shoreline, and mosquitoes buzzed around the work lamp, while my cordless drill echoed across the water. Unknown number. Calm voice. "Mr. Grady, this is Howard Bennett from the State Attorney General's office." I almost dropped the drill straight into the lake. He did not waste time with small talk. "You have been collecting records related to Willow Ridge HOA redevelopment activity." It was not a question. "Yes," I answered carefully. Rain clouds were gathering over the south side of the lake again. I could smell ozone in the air before the storm even arrived. Howard paused for a second before continuing. "You're not the only one investigating them." The wind shifted harder through the pine trees around my cabin. Somewhere out on the dark water, a loose buoy bell clanged softly against metal. Then Howard said the sentence that changed everything. "Mr. Grady, I believe your HOA is connected to a statewide land fraud operation, and I need a place where we can speak privately." Howard Bennett arrived at my cabin 3 nights later in a dark gray pickup truck covered in road salt and rain streaks. No government plates. No security detail. Nothing flashy. That alone told me he was taking the situation seriously. Powerful people trying to stay invisible always look more ordinary than everybody else. The storm rolling over Blackwater Lake that evening felt heavy enough to sink boats. Wind pushed hard against the pine trees around the shoreline, making the branches scrape against each other like old wooden beams shifting inside a house. I remember the smell most clearly. Vet sheeter, rainwater, fresh coffee brewing inside the cabin while thunder rolled low across the lake. Howard stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase worn soft around the edges from years of travel. Mid-50s, calm eyes, gray suit that looked expensive without trying too hard. He glanced around the cabin once before nodding toward the fireplace. "You kept the original structure." I shrugged while setting 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter. "My father built half of it himself." Howard ran his fingers lightly across one of the exposed cedar beams overhead. "Good craftsmanship lasts longer than politics." Funny thing for a state attorney general to say. We sat at the old oak table near the fireplace while rain hammered the roof hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Howard opened his briefcase and spread photographs across the table one by one. Different lake communities, different HOA boards, different counties. Same pattern every time. Elderly homeowners pressured into selling. Shoreline rezoning approvals pushed through suspiciously fast. Development corporations hidden behind layers of shell companies. Millions of dollars in lakefront acquisitions quietly moving across state lines. "Willow Ridge is not unique," Howard said calmly. It is one branch of a larger operation. My stomach tightened while I studied the photographs beneath the yellow cabin light. Families standing beside homes they no longer owned. Fishing docks bulldozed into empty shoreline. Newspaper clippings about redevelopment expansion projects promising luxury tourism revenue for struggling lake towns. Every story smelled the same. Money disguised as modernization. How high does this go? I asked quietly. Howard leaned back in his chair while thunder shook the windows again. Higher than most people around this lake would believe. Then he slid one final document across the table. Internal banking transfers tied directly to Travis Keene's law office and 2 state zoning officials currently under investigation. My pulse started hammering immediately. Cynthia had not just been harassing homeowners. She had been feeding land into a statewide corruption pipeline. Howard folded his hands together carefully. Mr. Grady, your documentation filled in gaps we could not prove before. I stared at the papers while wind whistled through the loose corner of the front porch outside. Everything suddenly made horrifying sense. The fear campaigns, the HOA violations, the forced sales, even the security patrols. Cynthia had been protecting an operation worth tens of millions of dollars. And now she knew I was pushing back publicly. That made me dangerous. Howard glanced toward the dark cabin windows facing the lake. You should also know something else. His voice lowered slightly. We intercepted communications earlier today suggesting somebody inside Willow Ridge plans to force accelerated acquisition proceedings against your property within the week. I laughed once under my breath. Not because it was funny, because it finally confirmed exactly how desperate Cynthia had become. Outside, headlights suddenly swept across the dock through the rain. Slow-moving, white beams cutting through darkness. Howard noticed immediately. So did I. Another pair of headlights followed behind the first. Then another. Gravel cracked beneath heavy tires outside the cabin, while engines idled near the shoreline. My chest tightened. Right on cue. Howard calmly closed the folder in front of him. No panique. No surprise. Just controlled patience. You told anyone I was meeting you here tonight? He asked. Not a soul. The wind slammed rain against the cabin hard enough to rattle the windows. Then came the sound of car doors opening outside. Multiple voices. Boots hitting soaked gravel. Flashlights sweeping across the dock. Through the front window, I could see Cynthia's white raincoat glowing beneath security floodlights like some angry ghost stalking the shoreline. She was moving fast. Now, too fast. That usually means somebody knows the walls are closing in. Howard quietly reached inside his jacket and removed a small digital recorder no bigger than a pack of gum. He placed it beside his coffee mug without saying a word. Outside, footsteps climbed onto my front porch. Heavy, confident. The old would groan beneath the pressure. Then Cynthia pounded the front door hard enough to shake the frame. Mason Grady, she shouted through the storm. Open this door immediately under emergency HOA authority. Howard looked at me once and gave the smallest nod imaginable. Calm, prepared, like a man who had been waiting a very long time for somebody to make exactly this mistake. The pounding on my front door kept getting louder. Not panicked, not yet. Cynthia still thought she controlled the situation. That was the dangerous thing about people who spend years bullying small communities. Eventually, they stop believing consequences apply to them at all. Rain hammered the cabin roof while flashlights swept across my windows in violent white streaks. I could hear one of the HOA security guards talking into a radio outside near the dock. Gravel crunched beneath boots, moving around the cabin perimeter like they were surrounding a fugitive instead of harassing a homeowner during a thunderstorm. Howard Bennett stayed perfectly calm. He picked up his coffee mug and took one slow sip while Cynthia slammed the door again hard enough to rattle the old cedar frame. This is your final warning, she shouted through the storm. You are obstructing an active HOA enforcement action. I almost smiled hearing that sentence. Active HOA enforcement action. Cynthia loved phrases that sounded official enough to scare people who did not know the law. Howard quietly reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a pair of reading glasses before looking toward me. "Mr. Grady," he said evenly, "would you mind opening the door?" The cabin suddenly felt very small. Fireplace crackling, rain hissing against the windows, the faint smell of cedar, smoke mixing with wet pine, drifting through the gaps in the walls. Outside, another lightning flash lit up Blackwater Lake bright enough to turn the shoreline silver for half a second. I stood slowly and walked toward the front door while the old floorboards creaked beneath my boots. Cynthia was still yelling when I unlocked the deadbolt. The second the door opened, cold, rain-filled wind slammed into the cabin, carrying the sharp smell of wet asphalt and expensive perfume. Cynthia stood on my porch drenched beneath her white raincoat, with 2 HOA guards behind her holding flashlights. Travis Keene stood farther back near the steps gripping an umbrella so tightly his knuckles looked pale under the porch light. Cynthia immediately pointed past me into the cabin. "You are in violation of emergency redevelopment enforcement under Article 9 Shoreline Compliance Authority." Her voice carried the confidence of somebody who had spent years threatening people into silence. Then she stepped inside without permission. Biggest mistake of her entire life. The moment Cynthia crossed the threshold, Howard Bennett calmly stood up from the oak table beside the fireplace. No dramatic music, no shouting, just quiet authority filling the room all at once. Rainwater dripped from Cynthia's coat onto the pine floor, while she froze mid-step staring at the man in the gray suit standing 10 feet away beneath the yellow cabin light. Howard adjusted his glasses slowly. "Good evening," he said calmly. "Howard Bennett, State Attorney General's office." Nobody moved. One of the security guards lowered his flashlight, immediately like his body understood the danger before his brain caught up. Travis Keene looked like all the oxygen had vanished from the cabin. Cynthia blinked twice fast. I was informed this property was under investigation for shoreline violations." Howard gave the faintest smile imaginable. "That is technically correct." The silence afterward felt massive. Outside, thunder rolled low across the lake while rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof. Cynthia tried recovering fast. She always did. "As HOA president, I have legal authority to inspect properties under emergency compliance review." Howard slowly picked up the small recorder sitting beside his coffee mug. "Excellent," he said quietly, "because your unauthorized entry, false enforcement claims, and interference with an active state investigation have now been fully documented." Cynthia's face changed instantly. Not fear yet. Confusion first. Then realization. Then fear. Real fear. The kind that drains color from people faster than winter lake water. Behind her, Travis Keene took one slow step backward toward the porch. Howard noticed immediately. "Mr. Keene," he said without raising his voice, "leaving now would be an exceptionally poor legal decision." That stopped him cold. Then came the moment Cynthia finally understood how badly she had miscalculated. Headlights suddenly flooded the shoreline outside the cabin. Not HOA vehicles this time. Dark, unmarked SUVs rolled silently onto the gravel road beside the dock one after another, while red and blue emergency lights reflected across the rain-covered lake like shattered glass. Doors opened. State investigators in dark jackets moved toward the cabin, carrying folders and evidence cases protected beneath rain covers. One of the HOA guards whispered something under his breath I could not hear clearly. Howard calmly reached into his inside jacket pocket and unfolded an official warrant packet onto the oak table. "Cynthia Voss," he said evenly, "your HOA organization is now subject to a formal state corruption and land fraud investigation effective immediately." Cynthia stared at the paperwork like somebody had just dropped a live grenade into her hands. The same woman who spent 4 years terrorizing homeowners over dock permits and mailbox colors suddenly looked very small, standing in my father's old lake cabin with rainwater dripping from her sleeves. By sunrise, Blackwater Lake looked like an entirely different place. The storm had finally passed sometime around 4 in the morning, leaving fog drifting low across the water while state investigators moved through Willow Ridge with clipboards, evidence boxes, and search warrants. The entire neighborhood smelled like wet pine needles, diesel exhaust, and fresh coffee from homeowners standing outside in bathrobes watching everything unravel in real time. Cynthia's perfect little shoreline kingdom collapsed. Faster than anybody expected once the investigators started pulling records. Turns out fear works both ways. The second people realized the state attorney general himself had walked into my cabin that night, homeowners who had stayed silent for years suddenly found their voices again. Retirees started handing over old violation letters. Contractors produced suspicious invoices. Former HOA employees came forward with internal emails and deleted accounting files they had secretly copied months earlier. One woman showed investigators photographs of Cynthia meeting privately with developers before public zoning votes even happened. Another homeowner turned over audio recordings from closed HOA meetings discussing forced compliance acquisition strategies. The deeper investigators dug, the uglier the lake became. Travis Keene's law office was searched before noon. By lunchtime, state officials froze multiple development accounts tied to shoreline acquisitions around Blackwater Lake. News vans started appearing near the marina entrance before sunset. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas broadcasting live, while residents gathered behind police barriers whispering to each other like survivors after a tornado. And right in the center of it all stood Cynthia Voss, wearing the same white raincoat from the night before, except now it looked wrinkled and exhausted beneath the flashing emergency lights. Gone was the polished confidence. Gone was the fake smile. She spent years making homeowners feel small. Funny how quickly power disappears once cameras arrive and paperwork starts talking louder than intimidation. I watched most of it from my dock with a cup of black coffee warming my hands against the cold morning wind. The lake looked calmer than it had in years. No security patrols. No HOA trucks circling the shoreline. Just the sound of waves tapping softly against old wooden pilings while gulls drifted overhead through pale gray clouds. Walter Pierce eventually walked down the dock, carrying a tackle box and 2 fishing rods. Same old flannel jacket. Same rough hands. He stopped beside me and stared across the water toward the clubhouse where investigators were still, carrying boxes outside. "Your father would have enjoyed seeing this," he muttered quietly. I smiled a little at that. Maybe he would have. Maybe he would have just shaken his head and gone back to repairing dock boards while everybody else panicked. That was the thing about my father. He trusted patience more than noise. We sat there for a while listening to the soft creak of rope against wood while fog rolled slowly across Blackwater Lake. My cabin still smelled faintly like cedar smoke from the night before. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof edge beside the porch where Cynthia had stood screaming about HOA authority less than 12 hours earlier. Funny how fast arrogance collapses once real authority enters the room. A week later, the state suspended all redevelopment activity connected to Willow Ridge pending criminal and financial review. Several shoreline sales were frozen. Multiple homeowners regained contested property rights. Cynthia resigned publicly through a statement written by attorneys that sounded nothing like the woman who used to threaten people across clubhouse tables. But the best part came quietly. No headlines, no television cameras. Just me standing on my dock one evening replacing the damaged front door Cynthia kicked open that stormy night. I rebuilt it using reclaimed oak boards from my father's old workshop. Strong wood. Honest wood. The kind that lasts. As the sun dropped low behind Blackwater Lake, golden light reflected across the water while the new door settled perfectly into the old cedar frame. Smooth. Solid. Permanent. Some people spend their lives believing power means controlling others through fear. But standing there beside my family cabin with sawdust on my boots and lake wind rolling through the trees, I realized something better. Real power does not scream through megaphones or hide behind HOA paperwork. Real power stays quiet, watches carefully, learns the law, then waits patiently for the right person to kick open the wrong door.